Hello, Sean here, and welcome back to the Bond in Context series, where I'm taking you through the historical context of the James Bond films. This is number 18 in our series, not counting the introduction. The last video was on the 6-year gap between License to Kill in 1989 and GoldenEye in 1995. So in this video, at last, we get to GoldenEye. This is many people's favorite Bond film. And I also know that the video game was especially popular. I'm not going to talk about the video game, but it certainly was groundbreaking. As we established in the last video, this film came at a particularly momentous time in history, as it is the first James Bond film made since the end of the Cold War. Now, I talked about all of that history in the last video about the gap, so if you haven't seen that, I suggest you go back and watch it now because it really is important. GoldenEye is regarded as a reboot of the Bond franchise. Certainly, it tries to establish the character and the meaning of the series in a new light, but what the producers were trying to do was not unprecedented. Think back to the early 1970s films, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, Man with a Golden Gun, which were all largely unsuccessful attempts to recreate Bond for the confusing 1970s, a time quite different than the suave, swinging 60s that the character originally seemed the embodiment of. The task in 1995 was even more daunting. Spy fiction as a genre developed in its purest form during the Cold War. Now the Cold War was over, so where do spies fit in that era, supposedly an era where Russia and the West are no longer direct antagonists? You have to give the production and creative team credit here. They were attempting something incredibly difficult and which could easily have failed badly. GoldenEye could easily have been the last James Bond film. I don't need to talk about how Pierce Brosnan got the role or how Timothy Dalton lost it. I covered Dalton's exit in the last video. Brosnan was, as usual, not the first choice. The producers had some interest in Hugh Grant, Liam Neeson, and incredibly Mel Gibson before turning back to Brosnan, who had been offered the part before, back in 1986, but he couldn't break away from the TV show Remington Steele. Scripts had been written by this point, locations scouted, evidently the general outline of the story was set by early 1994. Production commenced in early 1995, January, in a newly built studio in Hertfordshire, England. Shooting also occurred in Switzerland, basically the stunt at the beginning with the bungee jump off the dam, and then some second unit stuff in St. Petersburg, Russia. The satellite dish at the film's finale, said in the story to be in Cuba, is actually the Mount Arecibo Radio Observatory in Puerto Rico. This facility, which looks incredibly sinister but is actually used for peaceful purposes, pops up again in another 90s movie, Contact, with Jodie Foster, a realistic depiction of first contact with aliens. So let's set the stage historically for the world that GoldenEye was born into. The UK was in considerable political turmoil in 1995, and this involves a subject that gets its earliest mention in our series here in this video, but which is going to keep coming up repeatedly, especially in the later videos. And that concept is Brexit. Many people don't know this, but Brexit, the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union, almost happened a generation earlier in 1993. The European Union officially began with the Treaty of Maastricht, signed in Holland in 1992, just as British Prime Minister John Major was about to go into the general elections. British politics in both parties, Labour and Conservative, had increasingly been dominated by tension between what were called Euroskeptics, those who did not favor Britain being in some sort of European consortium, and those who did favor it. In fact, Margaret Thatcher's ouster in November 1990 was triggered partially over a dispute within her own party about whether the UK should join the European exchange rate mechanism, the forerunner of the euro, the unified currency of Europe. If you're interested in this, I did a whole webinar on Brexit that goes deeply into this backstory, and I'll put the link to that video in the description. Long story short, in 1993, there was a split in Major's Conservative Party in Parliament over ratifying the EU treaty, that Treaty of Maastricht I just mentioned. Major was in favor of it, but different parts of the party opposed the treaty for different reasons. Through some skillful maneuvering, Major outflanked them and quelled the rebellion in his own party, but it left him politically very weakened. Major's premiership was dogged by petty scandals. Various members of the cabinet and conservative MPs getting caught in sex scandals or being outed as gay after having made publicly homophobic statements, those kinds of things, kickbacks, sort of a low drip of bad news that sapped Major's authority and his ability to get anything done. Major became so fed up with the infighting in his own party that in June 1995, as GoldenEye was in production, he actually resigned as leader of the Conservative Party, mainly as a feint and an attempt to challenge the naysayers on his own bench to either put up or shut up. They ended up shutting up. Major was quickly re-elected as leader of the Tory party because there weren't very many viable alternatives, but it was clear that the Tories were going to go into the next election badly weakened. In the United States, Bill Clinton, who had won the 1992 election promising to feel the pain of workers displaced by the recession, had already faced several political crises of his own. An ill-fated attempt to get health care reform passed in Congress turned into a debacle. He was faced by two foreign policy challenges, and he managed to botch both of them. The first was the military mission to bring food aid to Somalia with the help of U.S. troops, a mission begun by George Bush I at the very end of his term. That became a live-fire battle with Somali warlords in Mogadishu in October 1993, the famous Black Hawk Down incident in which 18 American soldiers were killed and one dragged through the streets after he was dead. The second foreign policy crisis was the genocide in Rwanda, which began in the spring of 1994, an incredible wave of ethnic violence in which ultimately 800,000 people were killed, most with machetes, a truly awful, awful genocide that Clinton decided not to try to intervene to stop, mainly because he had been burned in the Somalia experience. Clinton has said in later years that he deeply regrets this decision. In the fall of 1994, the Republican Party racked up an impressive victory at the congressional level, retaking control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the 1950s. This set up a possibly inevitable showdown involving budget priorities, which led to the shutdown of the U.S. government beginning in November 1995, the month that GoldenEye was released. I'll talk about that in a minute. So why does any of this matter to GoldenEye? Well, it shows you what a totally different world Bond was now expected to operate in. A world where finances and currency-related decisions made or broke world leaders, and where rules for the application of military force were totally different than they had been in the Cold War era. To its credit, GoldenEye makes several major nods to this new political and economic reality. In one of the film's early sequences, Bond is getting a personnel evaluation from a young woman who he basically sexually harasses. The scene is played for laughs, but notably, laughs at Bond's expense. To my recollection, we have never before in the entire series been asked to laugh at the character of James Bond himself, as opposed to something funny, a quip, or something that he says. Just minutes later in the film, the new M, played by Judi Dench, tells Bond that he's a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War. And Bond doesn't even really try to defend himself against this. Absolutely new territory for the franchise. Of course, story-wise, the main thing involves the villains, who are Russians and recently ex-Soviets. The idea is that Russia is very confused, no one is sure where the chips are falling in this new political reality, and everyone's scrambling for their own piece of the pie. Notably the main villain, Alec Trevelyan, played by Sean Bean, who's trying to use the space-based laser system known as GoldenEye, built by the Russians, to wipe out evidence of a massive robbery of England by means of computer hijacking. All of this sounds very topical, and it is to an extent, but note that we've been here before. A space-based laser system was used in Diamonds Are Forever. The idea of a high-tech robbery is out of Goldfinger, and the obsession with computers and hacking is a more modernized update of some of the gags from A View to a Kill. Remember the microcomputers of the early 1980s. So as new and fresh as GoldenEye seems, there's a lot that's familiar here too. GoldenEye was also the first Bond film shepherded mainly by Barbara Broccoli, the daughter of longtime Bond producer Albert Broccoli, who was ill at the time of the production and didn't have much involvement with this one. In fact, he died in June 1996, and Barbara basically inherited the series. GoldenEye premiered on November 13th, 1995. Note that the producers were no longer trying to make Bond pictures into summer blockbusters anymore, as they had been trying in the 80s. It did brisk business and got generally good reviews. The day it opened was pretty fateful, as it came one day before the beginning of the federal government shutdown in the United States, that impasse of budget priorities between Clinton and the Republicans that I mentioned earlier. There were actually two shutdowns, one in November 1995, the other beginning in December, which stretched into January. During the second shutdown, President Bill Clinton began having his fateful affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. She was an unpaid intern and therefore was not affected by the furlough. This affair would eventually lead to Clinton's impeachment in 1998 and arguably the selection of George W. Bush as president in 2000. I want to mention one other historical note involving GoldenEye. The motive of the villain, Alec Trevelyan, to crash Britain's economic system is in part to get revenge for the betrayal by the British of ethnic Cossacks, referred to in the film as Lienz Cossacks, who were returned to the Soviet Union after World War II by agreement between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin at Yalta. This did happen. Many Cossacks had fled Russia during the Russian Civil War following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. When Hitler invaded the USSR in June 1941, some of these leaders returned, hoping to topple the Soviet regime. They weren't loyal to Hitler, but some did ostensibly cooperate with the Germans. As the war was ending, Stalin demanded the repatriation of as many Soviet or ex-Soviet citizens as he could possibly get his hands on. The Cossacks were just one of these many groups. The Allies agreed because if they didn't, Stalin would detain Allied POWs that the Russians had liberated from German camps at the end of the war. This was just one of numerous exchanges of populations, many of them forced relocations at the end of World War II, and most of these were unjust on numerous levels. A line of dialogue in the film establishes that the Cossacks were shot by Stalin when they returned, some on trains provided by the British. Not all were shot, many were sent to gulags in Siberia, but clearly the vast majority, judged by Stalin to be Nazi collaborators and enemies of the state, were repressed in some fashion. Thanks for watching. The next movie I'll deal with will be Tomorrow Never Dies, which is fascinating on many levels. So please like, subscribe, share, do all that stuff, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.